person, a child, that grows into adolescent, teenage, and then adult, everyone has 3 feminine and 3 masculine elements.
The third element
Of spiritual life. We're born in oneness with this uniqueness of self, but the life source that these 6 elements are, the 7th being the self of the human will, who child is naturally aligned with in its heart's thought process of thinking. Do you understand?
It is the power of transformation. It is the end result for the alchemist.
Stay with me. The first 3 elements are the birth of spiritual life inside the child. And get your religious dogma out of here for a second. Just listen and follow carefully, because it's important for you to know if you're a parent and if you want to learn how to communicate with child and grow that child into the productive adult that your heart's thought sees in the goodness of the well-being of your child. You see? Okay, so the 3 feminine elements of human spirit are that which births knowledge of the living, emotionally impacted self, and that uniqueness. And the uniqueness is learned in childhood through the first element, which is truth. Truth is fed to us all. Let's just say there's a spiritual seed that feeds us this.
Brain is capable of millions of neural nets.
Cascades of biochemical and
Emotional response.
Feeds us the knowledge of truth. And with a knowledge of truth learned in new human experience, as we grow through and learn through experiences, we have an emotional impact to experiences, knowing, and what we know in the experience is the experience, the truth of the experience. After we understand it logically, after thought has been impregnated by this feminine element, with the knowledge of truth from the experience, and then the emotional impact comes. The emotional impact is used as a guide to understanding first uniqueness and then the self-expression of that uniqueness. We see this in our children now before they're turned. Into the teenager short theory, and we call that innocence. We're very deeply moved by that, and knowing how the child works spiritually is knowing the spiritual mechanics of spirit and how they work. Okay, there's a ton of information to know, but this is the beginning, and the beginning of life in people. Okay, so truth and its emotional response gives a person knowing, a conscious awareness. Consciousness, that truth also provides thought and thought process. First thought is the first thought awareness in our experiences. As you're sitting here listening to me, it's a new experience for you. As I speak words, you're logically absorbing that and trying to understand them. That's a new experience. And because we're emotional creatures, we have emotional responses to those things. And if you're feeling those right now, then that's what I mean. But you're soon to feel them. And you felt them. You felt their emotional response, so you know what I'm talking about. That's the first feminine element of the spiritual life inside the child. The second one is once thought has become impregnated with the knowledge of truth through the experience, and then the emotional impact to help self-discover self and uniqueness of self. From this life source that truth is to us, wisdom, the wisdom of truth and emotional response. That's another feminine element because it births knowledge of the experience. So we go through our experiences and we accumulate a knowledge base of our experiences. Knowledge base is fed to us from the knowledge of truth, fed to us from the life source, fed to us from whatever feeds the life source. You decide what that is in your heart's thought, because it's unique to the individual.
The third element.
After wisdom sees the knowledge base of truth that we have, that helps us understand to the point that we understand now, more to learn, and we learn through the awareness of truth. So that's provided for. Life is provided for through truth. Wisdom of the two. Knowledge and the emotional response. The emotional response is its own knowledge base. It is the heart's thought. The heart's thought has a wisdom and a thought process. It connects with our masculine elements in thought. Anyway, wisdom explains a definition of the accumulation of the knowledge that we've experienced, you see? And it develops things like empathy. And we can act through empathy in other people, feel loved by the actions of goodness. And what that takes is a person to calculate thought with intellect's feminine element is wisdom. Okay, so truth and logic is one element that brings life of that understanding. Truth in its understanding. Intellect and wisdom brings us to a light and logic, a greater light and logic that defines the first thought's understanding of our human truth. Do you see? So through intellect and wisdom, the lower levels of truth and logic that provide the information, we are led there through intellect and wisdom. As long as we keep calculating thought, heart's thought, with the wisdom of good,
The third element.
instead of the rejecting one, because rejection of human emotion, truthful human emotion in a child, is seeking, a child speaks and seeks knowledge. That's the joy and the innocence part, when a child feels acknowledged. But when we reject them on purpose or not, and a lot of it's not on purpose, we think we're doing the right thing, but what we're doing is really killing off the spiritual life inside the child. It happened to each one of us, and each one of us know what that means. Well, now there's a map in understanding how that works. So now you don't have to. You have to develop yourself into a balanced, determined self in order to be the acknowledgement model of parenting
The third element.
for which every child needs to maintain itself throughout into adult land without becoming reckless and self-destructive and a drain on community instead of a contributor. We are not bad people. We're not evil. There's an element, you know how life I just described, and you get that? An elemental, dark source of spiritual influence inside each of us because it's invited through the rejection model of parenting. Its dangers are the result of what we see in the world today. Each generation of human being used to think in terms of life. Now we think in terms of spiritual death of that life, the innermost truth of the self, because we fear so terribly the humiliation, the stem result emotions of negative feeling that are left unresolved, that connect with early childhood feelings of humiliation, embarrassment, and ridicule. When we think we're going to feel that, we shut down, we don't express, and in that way we're in prison. The child becomes imprisoned inside his fear. Fear has, and those are the dark elements of the dark spiritual nature of people. It's fear. Fear has one emotion. It's fear of what, though? Fear of the emotional truth of the self. There's nothing to fear except for that first. And when we obey that fear, we say nothing, and in that, and when we don't work through our emotional selves as part of our life source, then we get all jammed up. The electromagnetic pulse in our hearts does no longer align with the Earth's magnetic pulse, in which thought and heart's thought, you see, connect and produce the same pulse. Ask your scientist. But when we don't self-express like a child does naturally, which we're supposed to maintain throughout our lives, but don't, it's because of the rejection model of parenting. If you're going to reject child, you're creating a monster of duality and spiritual nature, of fearing loss in thought of self-expression. The extreme of that is Hitler's in the world, is at the other end of that. Homeless people, junkies, mental illness that's allowed to rot out like this. The final masculine element is the human will of the self, the uniqueness of that self, that truth, emotion, and wisdom and intellect tell self that self is.
With the power of transformation. It is the end result for the alchemist.
So the first four elements, masculine and feminine elements in human self that birth life, in which we are naturally inclined to rebirth life from that life.
The third element.
In childhood, are turned by the dark spiritual nature of fear and fearing loss. Truth, movement, gut feeling, intuition. We've been calling, I don't remember anybody ever calling it a life source, but it is. That's what it is. It births knowledge of
The third element.
That if they can understand God's anatomy, they can learn how his powers work. These ancient drawings reveal that God's body is similar to humans. The top symbolizes God's head, which is the source of will, wisdom, and understanding. Below that are symmetrically arranged organs and limbs, representing love, power, beauty, eternity, and splendor. The most unusual part of the diagram contains sensual imagery. The ninth part of God, called the foundation, is the phallus, or procreative life force of the universe. But according to the Sephiroth, God also has female components. The final element, often called Shekinah, was depicted as the feminine half of God. This image challenged the age-old view of a strictly masculine God.
Who are we? Where do we come from? What should we do? And where are we going?
Why are we here? Well, that is the ultimate question, isn't it?
To bring about in the human mind the radical revolution. The crisis is a crisis in consciousness. Man, he's still as he was. He's still brutal, violent, aggressive, acquisitive, competitive, and he has built a society along these lines. A crisis that cannot anymore accept the old norms.
I had the game wrong. The game was to find out what I already was.
What we find for the first time is that this feminine aspect, the feminine consort of God, is divine and is part of the divinity.
So to unite the male and female halves of God, this becomes the goal of the whole system. It describes that union in very graphic terms. There really is a romance within God. One brings together these two halves of God. You might say that this is how we actualize the divine potential in the world.
One thing I've learned in the last 7 years, in every game and con, there is always an opponent. There is always a victim.
But we both know what you are, don't we? You're a man who needs a mask.
The trick is to know when you're the latter, so you can become the former.